Flames do not simply burn. They erase. They redraw. They take a map you thought you knew and tear it apart until the land itself becomes unrecognizable. Australia, 2019. What if it happened not in centuries, but in weeks? Whole forests gone, blackened to bone. Rivers choking on ash. A continent gasping under skies that turned blood red at noon. Imagine what would happen if fire moved not as an element, but as a conqueror, consuming 19 million hectares, forcing animals into flight, suffocating billions in smoke that climbed into the stratosphere and circled the earth. What if history itself combusted? Entire species scorched to silence, landscapes permanently shifted, ecosystems rewritten like a book torn apart mid-sentence. It wasn't nature alone, it was something darker, a collision of drought, searing heat, and human denial, fusing into a storm of firestorms so vast they birthed their own weather. Towns trapped, seas of flame surrounding families with nowhere left to run. The world called it Black Summer, but the name cannot hold the terror. These fires were not disasters, they were verdicts. A reminder that a continent built on fire had reached a point of no return. What if it happens again? What if this was only the beginning? Australia has always carried fire in its bones. A continent defined not by calm stability, but by a harsh rhythm of heat, drought, and flame. The land itself bears the imprint of fire across its geography. From the arid interior, where spinifex grasslands stretch across deserts, to the coastal forests of towering eucalypts, whose very biology depends on burning. Every ecosystem is tied to fire. This is not incidental. It is structural. Eucalyptus leaves brim with flammable oils. Bark peels away in ribbons that ignite easily, and seeds often refuse to germinate until flames have scorched the ground. Spinifex burns in quick, rolling sheets, its fires sweeping across the outback with speed, clearing space for regrowth. Even grasslands evolved with burning as a constant. Fire did not merely destroy, it renewed, carving cycles of death and rebirth into the continent's ecological clock. Australia's climate, marked by extremes of searing summers, erratic rainfall, and long droughts, turned fire into a force as natural and relentless as the tides. For tens of thousands of years, humans worked with this fire, not against it. The First Nations peoples of Australia, with histories stretching back at least 65,000 years, developed a relationship with fire so intricate it reshaped entire landscapes. Their method, known as fire stick farming, was not farming in the European sense of plows and fields, but a precise system of controlled burns, set with careful timing and deep ecological knowledge. Small, cool fires were lit to clear undergrowth, to open pathways through forests, to encourage the growth of fresh shoots for grazing animals. These fires reduced the risk of catastrophic infernos by preventing the buildup of dense, dry fuel. Over time, they created mosaics of vegetation at different stages of regrowth, producing rich habitats that sustained biodiversity across vast areas. Historical evidence shows this practice stretched back into antiquity. Charcoal deposits and soil layers, going back tens of millennia, reveal burning as a continuous presence. European settlers arriving in 1788 often described landscapes that seemed deliberately tended. Open grasslands between stands of trees, where kangaroos grazed in abundance, and where visibility stretched far through what should have been dense bush. This was not untouched wilderness. It was a managed environment, crafted with fire as the primary tool. Fire stick farming was not only ecological management, but also cultural. Fires were used to protect sacred sites, to signal across distances, to shape hunting grounds. The timing of burns was tied to the seasons, animal migrations, and plant cycles. In northern Australia, for example, indigenous groups lit fires at the end of the wet season, producing controlled burns that allowed new grasses to sprout just as wildlife passed through. In the cooler southern regions, autumn burns prepared the land for winter. The knowledge was localized, passed through generations, adapted to every climate zone: tropical savanna, desert, temperate woodland. Each community understood its land intimately, and fire was the thread that bound survival, culture, and ecology together. But colonization in the late 18th and 19th centuries tore this system apart. European settlers, arriving with their own vision of agriculture, saw fire differently. To them, burning was a threat, an uncontrolled force that threatened pastures, crops, and buildings. They sought to suppress it wherever possible. Forests were cleared, grasslands converted to grazing fields, and indigenous fire practices were criminalized or disregarded. Where indigenous burns once maintained balance, fuel began to accumulate: fallen branches, dry undergrowth, dense thickets. Over decades, the land shifted. What had been open, fire-managed landscapes became tinderboxes waiting for ignition. Historical records from the 19th century show the consequences of this disruption. Catastrophic bushfires began to appear with increasing severity. In 1851, Victoria's Black Thursday saw fires burn across 5 million hectares in a single day, fueled by extreme heat and dry fuel that had not been managed through controlled burns. Newspapers described skies darkened at noon, ash falling hundreds of kilometers away, livestock and homesteads consumed without warning. This was a forewarning of what would come in future centuries. The loss of indigenous fire knowledge magnified Australia's vulnerability to disaster. Geography compounded the danger. Australia sits in one of the driest inhabited continents on Earth. Its interior deserts, semi-arid plains, and vast eucalypt forests all contribute to fire risk. Seasonal climate systems, such as the El Niño, Southern Oscillation, intensify droughts, drying fuel to dangerous levels. Heat waves sweep across the land, pushing temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius in many regions. When these conditions align, the result is an inevitability. Fire spreads not as isolated incidents, but as colossal fronts spanning hundreds of kilometers. Yet even as suppression policies dominated the 19th and 20th centuries, the land's dependence on fire never disappeared. Forests thickened unnaturally, creating fuel loads far beyond historical levels. Grasslands lost their open structure. Species adapted to frequent, low-intensity burns faced collapse as their habitats vanished. The absence of fire proved as damaging as fire itself. Research in the 20th century began to confirm what indigenous Australians had known all along, that without fire, ecosystems faltered. Controlled burning re-entered the national conversation, yet never on the scale once practiced over tens of thousands of years. The continent's fire story is not just ecological. It is political, cultural, and historical. Fire stick farming was more than a technique. It was an inheritance of knowledge, fractured under colonization, and only partly acknowledged in modern fire management. Today, Aboriginal fire practices are increasingly recognized for their effectiveness, with projects in Northern Australia demonstrating reduced emissions, healthier ecosystems, and greater protection against catastrophic fires. Yet the scars of 2 centuries of disruption remain visible across landscapes transformed by neglect and misunderstanding. Australia is unique in the way fire underpins its identity. No other continent has vegetation so primed to ignite, climates so tuned to extremes, and histories so tied to controlled burning. Every drought, every heat wave, every lightning storm presses against this fragility. Fire is not an intruder. It is a native force, written into the DNA of eucalypts, etched into the soils by millennia of burning, sustained through traditions older than recorded history. But when those traditions were broken, the balance tilted. The continent became more volatile, more exposed, its ecosystems reshaped by both flame and the absence of it. What if the land itself has always been a battlefield between control and catastrophe? What if the Black Summer fires of 2019 to 2020 were not anomalies, but the violent reemergence of a cycle interrupted? Fire was once harnessed by hands that understood it. When that knowledge was silenced, the land remembered, but in ways far more destructive. And so Australia's story begins not in the firestorms of the modern age, but in the ancient burns that once sustained life, and the fracture that came when those fires were taken away. The disaster of 2019 to 2020 did not appear without warning. It was written into the land months before the first flames took hold, an accumulation of extremes pressing Australia toward catastrophe. The continent had endured dry years before, but the years leading into Black Summer were marked by a relentless drought that stripped the soil of life. From 2017 through 2019, rainfall dropped to historic lows across large swaths of the country. By the end of 2019, the Murray-Darling Basin, the agricultural heartland, recorded its lowest rainfall on record. Water storages fell, rivers shrank to trickles, and farmlands turned to dust. The land was brittle, every blade of grass crisp, every forest floor littered with dry debris. When soil moisture collapsed, roots no longer held the ground. Landscapes became fuel waiting for the first spark. At the same time, Australia endured a succession of extreme heat waves that pushed the atmosphere to breaking point. December 2019 marked the hottest month ever recorded nationwide, with the mean temperature climbing to 41.9 degrees Celsius on December 18th, breaking the record set just a day earlier. In Sydney, Canberra, Adelaide, and countless rural towns, heat records fell one after another. Temperatures that once seemed unthinkable became normal within weeks. The air dried further. Moisture evaporated from the soil. Plants wilted, reservoirs dropped, and the natural defenses that might have slowed a blaze vanished. By the time the first large fires began in September 2019, the continent was already primed to burn in a way modern Australia had never seen. Behind these extremes were powerful climate drivers that shaped the conditions with precision. The Indian Ocean Dipole IOD, a phenomenon where sea surface temperatures swing between warmer and cooler phases, locked into a strongly positive phase in 2019. Warm waters accumulated in the western Indian Ocean, while cooler waters settled to the east near Indonesia. This imbalance disrupted atmospheric circulation, weakening rainfall systems that usually deliver moisture to southern and eastern Australia. The result was a choking dryness, a season where rain simply refused to fall. At the same time, the Southern Annular Mode SAM, which measures shifts in the westerly winds circling Antarctica, swung into a negative phase. Normally, in summer months, those winds retreat poleward, sparing southern Australia from their force. But in late 2019, they shifted northward, dragging hot, dry air across the continent and fanning existing fires into infernos. These two climatic drivers, IOD and SAM, interacted like opposing blades of a scissor, slicing away the margin of safety. What might have been a difficult summer became a nightmare. The vulnerability was not confined to one corner of the continent. It stretched from the dry grasslands of Queensland in the north to the cool forests of Victoria in the south. In Queensland, vast tracts of grass and woodland dried into a blanket of flammable material, where lightning strikes could ignite fires that galloped across plains. In New South Wales, eucalyptus forests lining the Great Dividing Range became powder kegs. Further south, Victoria's East Gippsland, dense with alpine ash and temperate rainforest, transformed into one of the most dangerous fire zones in the nation. Even South Australia's Kangaroo Island, a place often imagined as refuge for biodiversity, was in the crosshairs. The scale of exposure was national. Every state, every climate zone, was tied into the same web of risk. Warnings had been delivered long before the first plumes of smoke rose. Scientists and fire agencies issued repeated statements throughout 2018 and 2019 that conditions were trending toward unprecedented danger. The Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Center, in its 2019 seasonal outlook, explicitly noted that above normal fire potential stretched across much of the East Coast and Tasmania. Firefighters who had worked decades in the field said openly that the land felt drier, the bush heavier with fuel, the risk sharper than anything they had faced before. The Climate Council, an independent scientific body, pointed to climate change as a multiplier that would ensure longer, hotter fire seasons. Yet these warnings were met with dismissal in political chambers. The fire chiefs, who asked for more aerial firefighting resources in April 2019, were brushed aside. Appeals to consider the scale of coming risks were treated as exaggeration. Inaction set the stage for disaster. The landscape itself carried silent testimony of what was coming. By August 2019, the drought had killed thousands of fish in the Darling River as flows collapsed. Farmers across New South Wales and Queensland destocked herds, unable to feed or water them. In Canberra, the air grew dusty, a symptom of bone-dry paddocks across surrounding regions. Satellites recorded soil moisture levels at some of the lowest ever observed across Southeast Australia. Every piece of evidence, from rivers to forests, pointed in the same direction. The land could no longer resist fire. September 2019 confirmed the fears. In Queensland and northern New South Wales, early-season blazes erupted, some in rainforest regions that historically rarely burned. Fires tore through Binnaburra in the Gold Coast hinterland, a heritage-listed rainforest lodge destroyed in days. Scientists were stunned. Rainforests that had survived for centuries without major fires now burned because drought had stripped them of resilience. The season had only just begun, and already the rules of fire in Australia were breaking. As the months rolled on, the scale of vulnerability revealed itself in terrifying clarity. By October, catastrophic fire warnings were issued in parts of New South Wales, the highest level of alert in the nation's system. The geography of danger extended across coastal towns, mountain valleys, farmland, and even the outskirts of major cities. Sydney and Brisbane began to choke on smoke long before the peak of summer. By November, flames reached the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, threatening landscapes of World Heritage significance. The fires were not random. They were the product of precise, identifiable forces: drought, heat waves, soil collapse, and climatic drivers colliding in unison. Every warning light had been flashing. Every signal was clear. Yet as 2019 turned toward its brutal summer, Australia entered with little more than hope that the worst could be avoided. The land was brittle, the air hotter than ever recorded, the atmosphere locked in patterns that denied rain. Fire agencies braced themselves with limited resources, volunteers already stretched thin. On maps across fire command centers, red zones spread wider each week. Every state, every forest, every patch of grassland was part of the same looming crisis, a crisis built not in days or weeks, but in years of neglect and extremes compounded. What would happen when a continent so primed for fire reaches this threshold? The answer would soon ignite in flames that would consume the nation's memory and redraw its ecosystems forever. The first great ignition came in September 2019, long before the calendar marked the start of summer. Queensland's dry forests and grasslands, starved of rain and bristling with fuel, were the opening stage. Lightning strikes cracked over parched ridges, setting alight landscapes that had no resistance left. Fires burned through the Gold Coast hinterland, consuming Binnaburra, a rainforest lodge that had stood since 1933. For the first time in living memory, wet subtropical rainforests, ecosystems thought to resist flames, caught and carried fire. To scientists, this was a signal that the boundaries of what could burn in Australia had shifted. To communities, it was the first taste of what was to come. Northern New South Wales followed within days. By early September, more than 80 fires blazed across the state. The tinder-dry eucalyptus forests of the Clarence Valley and the northern tablelands lit up, throwing columns of smoke high above the landscape. Homes were lost, families evacuated, and fire crews stretched across impossible distances. September had never before been marked by such scale. The season had broken its usual boundaries. The land was burning earlier, faster, with an intensity that left no room to recover. October did not bring relief. Fires multiplied, each ignition feeding on forests layered with dry fuel. The geography of fire spread like an unbroken chain, north to south, coast to inland. Lightning started many of them, but human activity added more. Machinery sparks, electrical faults, accidental ignitions. Every ember mattered when the land was so dry that even a stray flame could leap into a forest canopy. The atmosphere itself turned dangerous. Heat waves dried the air further, and strong winds drove flames across ridges and valleys. Fires did not crawl, they sprinted. In just hours, they leapt across rivers, highways, and containment lines that had once stopped lesser blazes. By late October, New South Wales entered uncharted territory. The fires spread into the Hawkesbury and Hunter regions, threatening communities only a short distance from Sydney. On October 26th, catastrophic fire danger ratings were declared for parts of the state, an official recognition that conditions were at the very edge of human control. Coastal towns along the mid-north coast faced evacuation warnings, while rural properties already counted losses in the hundreds. Residents described fire fronts arriving with no time to prepare, flames advancing not in minutes, but in seconds. November tore away the last illusions of control. On November 8th, more than 100 fires burned across New South Wales and Queensland, with dozens declared out of control. That week, the unprecedented became ordinary. 575 homes destroyed in just a few days, 6 people dead. Hundreds of schools closed as smoke blanketed towns. On November 12th, catastrophic fire danger was declared for Greater Sydney for the first time in recorded history. This was no longer a rural disaster. It had reached the edges of Australia's largest city. Smoke thickened over Sydney Harbour, the Opera House barely visible, air quality plunging to some of the worst levels on Earth. What had happened when a nation's capital cities themselves were smothered by the fires of their hinterlands? That question was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time. The geography of ignition became impossible to map without pages of red. Fires burned in Queensland's Granite Belt, in northern New South Wales's Clarence Valley, in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, in the forests of the mid-north coast, in Victoria's Alpine Edge. Every state except Tasmania recorded significant fires by November. The land had become a patchwork of fronts, each vast enough to define a crisis on its own, yet together forming a continent-wide catastrophe. Satellite images showed smoke stretching from Australia into the Pacific, carried thousands of kilometers by upper atmosphere winds. The scale was visible from space, the plumes forming a gray-brown veil that reached New Zealand and beyond. Fuel loads made every ignition lethal. Forest floors held years of unburned material, branches, leaves, bark, that caught and spread flames upward into tree canopies. Once the crown of a eucalypt forest ignited, fires became uncontrollable walls of heat and light, throwing embers ahead for kilometers. Spot fires leapt containment lines, igniting new fronts. Firefighters, many of them volunteers, faced conditions where hoses turned to steam before reaching the flames. Aircraft dropped water and retardant, but the scale overwhelmed capacity. Some fire fronts measured over 1,000 kilometers combined, crossing state borders with ease. Maps from November 2019 show entire regions shaded in fire symbols, their density so great that individual fronts blurred into a single wave of red. Coastal towns were trapped between two forces, the fire pressing in from the west and the Pacific Ocean at their backs. In Port Macquarie, flames reached suburban streets, while koalas burned in the surrounding eucalyptus forests, drawing international attention to the loss of wildlife. In the Northern Rivers region, families evacuated with minutes' notice. Roads choked as thousands fled toward beaches. The ocean became the last line of escape. In the Hawkesbury, fires crept close enough to threaten the outskirts of Sydney itself, embers raining over suburbs that had never before faced such danger. By the end of November, more than 1.6 million hectares had already burned in New South Wales alone, more than the total area of any previous full season. Hundreds of homes lay in ruins. Dozens of lives had been lost. Firefighters worked without pause, their efforts heroic yet dwarfed by the magnitude of what spread before them. The season still had its hottest months ahead. The fires that began in September were no longer isolated disasters. They were the opening act of Black Summer, a chain of ignitions that stitched themselves into a single national trauma, a season where maps became unreadable, fire fronts infinite, and the land itself transformed into flame. December 2019 marked the moment when fire ceased to be regional and became continental. The land that had burned for months now reached a point of saturation, and the scale of ignition exceeded anything modern Australia had endured. In New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia, smaller blazes converged into megafires, uncontrollable complexes that devoured everything in their path. The transition was not gradual. It came suddenly, with December heat waves pushing temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius across multiple states, and strong winds transforming isolated fronts into walls of flame stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Firefighters described conditions where the fire line was no longer a line. It was a horizon. The Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, became one of the first epicenters. World Heritage-listed landscapes, dominated by eucalyptus forests and sandstone cliffs, turned into furnaces. By mid-December, around 20% of the Blue Mountains had been consumed, an ecological catastrophe without precedent. The Gros Valley, long considered one of the most pristine wilderness areas in eastern Australia, burned in a single night when flames roared down its escarpments. Villages like Blackheath and Mount Victoria prepared for evacuation, with ember storms showering homes kilometers ahead of the main front. By Christmas, more than 60% of the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area had been burned, an area so vast it exceeded the size of Belgium. What had happened when a landscape recognized for its global significance is erased in weeks? That question became reality as smoke rose over Sydney, blotting out daylight. In Victoria, East Gippsland bore the brunt. On December 30th, 2019, strong winds from the northwest fanned dozens of existing fires into a fire front hundreds of kilometers long. Towns like Orbost, Canriver, and Malakuta were suddenly in the path of flames that moved faster than evacuation could allow. In Malakuta, more than 4,000 people fled to the beach as the fire descended, the only escape blocked by burning forests, and the ocean their last refuge. Navy ships HMAS Shule and MV Sycamore were dispatched days later to evacuate thousands from a coast, one of the largest peacetime maritime rescues in Australian history. By January, East Gippsland had lost more than 1.2 million hectares of forest, including alpine ash stands that may never regenerate. South Australia faced its own devastation. Kangaroo Island, often described as a sanctuary of biodiversity, lost nearly half its landmass to fire in January 2020. Sparked by lightning strikes on December 20th, the blaze grew uncontrollably, merging into fire complexes that consumed Flinders Chase National Park. Thousands of koalas, unique to the island and previously spared from mainland disease, perished. Endangered species like the Kangaroo Island dunart faced near extinction. Farmers lost homes, livestock, and livelihoods in hours. The geography of Kangaroo Island, with its dense vegetation and rugged terrain, allowed the fire to spread with a speed that overwhelmed firefighting efforts. The island, long a refuge for life, became a graveyard. The concept of the megafire became central to understanding this period. A megafire occurs when individual blazes merge into a single, unified inferno so vast it generates its own weather. This was not theoretical. It happened repeatedly across December and January. On December 6th, the Gospers Mountain Fire northwest of Sydney, already massive, merged with neighboring blazes to form the largest single fire complex recorded in Australian history. By the time it was eventually extinguished in February, it had consumed more than 512,000 hectares. The Curwen Fire on the south coast of New South Wales similarly raged for 74 days, burning nearly 500,000 hectares before containment. These megafires created pyrocumulonimbus clouds, towering thunderheads of smoke and flame that generated lightning strikes, sparking new fires dozens of kilometers ahead. The fires birthed their own storms, a feedback loop where the atmosphere itself became weaponized. The scale of smoke was unlike anything ever recorded in Australia. By early January 2020, plumes rose so high they penetrated the stratosphere, injecting particles into atmospheric layers where they circled the globe. NASA satellites tracked smoke traveling east across the Pacific, reaching New Zealand within days and darkening its glaciers with ash. By mid-January, the smoke had crossed South America, detected in Chile and Argentina, halfway around the world from its source. These plumes rivaled those produced by volcanic eruptions, altering global atmospheric circulation. The fires were no longer an Australian disaster alone. They had become planetary in scale. In Canberra, Australia's capital, the consequences were immediate. On January 1, 2020, Smoke pushed air quality to more than 20 times the hazardous level, the worst of any major city worldwide that day. Hospitals filled with patients suffering respiratory distress. Flights were canceled, public institutions closed. Across Sydney, Melbourne, and regional centers, millions breathed air ranked among the most toxic on Earth. For weeks, daily life was conducted under skies stained brown and orange, the air carrying particles fine enough to infiltrate lungs and bloodstream. By mid-January, the statistics were staggering. More than 10 million hectares burned nationwide, an area larger than South Korea. Dozens of people had lost their lives. More than 2,000 homes were destroyed. Wildlife losses were later estimated at 3 billion animals killed or displaced. The fires had become not just widespread, but simultaneous. Multiple states battling crises of equal magnitude, their resources stretched to the breaking point. Fire crews from the United States, Canada, and New Zealand were flown in to assist, highlighting the sheer impossibility of containing the scale with domestic forces alone. The land itself was transformed. Forests that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened trunks. Alpine regions, which rarely burned, were stripped bare. Rainforests scorched. Rural towns abandoned. Coastal communities cut off for weeks as roads and power lines collapsed. In every state, cartographers redrew maps of fire fronts daily, their symbols multiplying until whole regions disappeared under red shading. The season had moved beyond anything measurable by past experience. Every record, temperature, hectares burned, emissions released, smoke spread, was broken. From December 2019 to January 2020, Australia faced an inferno across the continent. The Blue Mountains scarred, East Gippsland engulfed, Kangaroo Island devastated, and smoke carried across oceans. Fires merged into megafires, creating their own storms, their own weather, their own reality. The air itself became an agent of destruction, carrying fire forward, carrying smoke beyond borders. What did happen when a nation finds its skies, its forests, its animals, and its people consumed at once? The answer lay in those weeks when Australia burned not as a collection of regions, but as an entire continent ablaze. Human survival during the Black Summer was never guaranteed. Entire communities were placed under siege, and every town caught in the fire's path was forced into decisions that no one should ever face, whether to leave with minutes to spare or stay and defend homes against flames that defied defense. In late December 2019 and through January 2020, the full weight of the disaster shifted onto people. It was no longer an abstract environmental crisis. It was lived on the ground, in rural towns cut off by fire fronts, in coastal settlements choked by smoke, and in cities that could not breathe. Malakuta, on the far eastern edge of Victoria, became the defining image of human struggle. On the morning of December 31st, 2019, more than 4,000 residents and holidaymakers were forced onto the foreshore when fires closed in from all sides. The sky turned an unearthly crimson, later remembered as the red sky moment, when daylight was extinguished at 9 a.m. and replaced with a darkness lit only by flames. Families huddled on the sand, some clutching children, others holding pets, as emergency sirens echoed through smoke so thick that visibility dropped to meters. The town had only one road in or out, but it was already blocked by fire. What had happened when the only escape is the ocean, and the fire leaves no landward path? That question became reality as people prepared to wade into the sea. The evacuation that followed was unprecedented. Navy vessels HMAS Shule and MV Sycamore arrived days later to transport thousands away from the burning coastline. It was the largest maritime evacuation in Australia since World War II. Helicopters ferried supplies, while trucks carried the injured through smoke-filled roads where flames pressed close enough to warp metal. The scale of the operation revealed a geographic truth. Coastal towns, surrounded by bushland and accessible only by winding roads, were uniquely vulnerable. Fire didn't just threaten homes, it trapped people, cutting off all options but endurance. Across New South Wales, similar stories unfolded. On January 4th, 2020, the South Coast became one of the most dangerous places in the country. Towns like Bateman's Bay, Maruya, and Ulladulla saw firestorms sweep through residential streets. More than 400 homes were destroyed along the coast that day alone. Electricity grids failed, phone reception collapsed, and gas stations closed. Supermarkets ran bare. Tens of thousands fled to evacuation centers, while others crowded into showgrounds or beaches, breathing air heavy with ash. It was not a single fire, but dozens burning simultaneously, their fronts stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Fire crews, outnumbered and exhausted, moved from street to street, knowing they could not save every house. Geographic isolation made the challenge almost insurmountable. In rural communities like Cobargo in New South Wales, the fire struck in the early hours of December 31, 2019. Residents described hearing a roar before flames swept through the town's main street, destroying shops, homes, and its historic buildings. 3 lives were lost in that single attack. The town's location, surrounded by forested hills and distant from major highways, meant firefighting reinforcements arrived too late. The same was true across much of rural Victoria and southern New South Wales. Distance itself became an enemy. Fire trucks had to cover vast territories, often unable to reach communities before flames did. Homes were not the only losses. Cultural landmarks, some standing for generations, vanished. The Mogo Zoo on the New South Wales south coast was nearly overtaken, with keepers forced to defend enclosures with hoses and buckets. In Gippsland, historic timber bridges and sawmills dating to the early 20th century were consumed. Aboriginal cultural sites, woven into landscapes for tens of thousands of years, were damaged or obliterated, their destruction compounding trauma for First Nations communities already displaced by fire. Churches, community halls, and century-old farmhouses burned to foundations, stripping rural towns of their heritage, as well as their shelter. Lives were taken in ways both sudden and relentless. As of mid-January, more than 30 people had died, many trapped while defending property or caught on roads overtaken by flames. On December 30th, in the Victorian High Country, a father and son died trying to protect their family farm near Corryong. In New South Wales, volunteer firefighter Jeffrey Keaton was killed on December 19th when a tree struck his truck near Buxton, south of Sydney. His comrade Andrew O'Dwyer died alongside him. Their deaths underscored the peril faced by those who volunteered to fight an enemy that could not be subdued. The volunteer firefighting forces became the backbone of the national response. In New South Wales alone, the Rural Fire Service had 70,000 volunteers. They came from every background: farmers, mechanics, teachers, retirees, men and women who left their jobs and families for weeks on end. They fought with equipment often outdated, facing conditions so extreme that protective gear sometimes melted. Across Victoria, the Country Fire Authority faced similar pressures, defending thousands of kilometers of fire front with crews who had little rest. For many, the fight was not for strangers, but for their own towns, their own streets, their own homes. But the challenge was overwhelming. Fires stretched across landscapes so vast that entire regions were undefendable. In New South Wales alone, more than 5 million hectares burned by early January 2020. How could any force, no matter how dedicated, hold lines against a front hundreds of kilometers long? Reinforcements arrived from overseas, firefighters from the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. But even they confronted a reality where the land itself dictated defeat. Aircraft water bombers circled the skies, dropping thousands of liters, yet the flames swallowed entire valleys before the water hit the ground. Communities lived under siege for weeks at a time. Supermarkets imposed rations, fuel was guarded, and generators became lifelines as power grids collapsed. Schools closed, hospitals evacuated, and residents camped in showgrounds with livestock. Air quality in Canberra on January 1st, 2020 was recorded at 20 times hazardous levels, the worst in the world. For the elderly, for infants, for the sick, breathing itself became dangerous. The fires pressed relentlessly against human endurance, testing not just physical survival, but mental resilience. In those weeks, Australia became a landscape where humanity itself seemed fragile. Towns like Malakuta, Cobargo, Bateman's Bay, Orbost, and countless others carried the scars of siege. Families returned to foundations where homes once stood. Volunteers carried the burden of entire regions, holding hoses against infernos that did not yield. Lives were cut short, landmarks erased, entire communities reshaped. What had happened when a continent-sized fire does not just consume trees and soil, but entire ways of life? That question was answered each day as people fought not only for survival, but for the endurance of their history, their memory, their place on the land. 19 million hectares burned during the Black Summer. The number alone feels impossible to hold, but every hectare was forest, grassland, wetland, or desert scrub. Every hectare was alive before the fires and scarred afterward. This was not simply destruction of trees or grass. It was the unraveling of entire ecosystems across a continent. The scale of ecological havoc is measured not only in hectares, but in the collapse of balance that had taken millions of years to shape. By early 2020, scientists estimated that more than 3 billion animals were killed or displaced. That figure was not an exaggeration, but a calculation based on population densities and fire footprints. 3 billion individual lives, each part of a chain of survival now broken. Koalas in New South Wales, already under stress from habitat loss and disease, were incinerated in their trees or left with burned paws and singed fur, unable to climb. Kangaroos fled into roads and fences, many dying in flight. Birds fell from the sky, their wings scorched midair. Reptiles and frogs, slower to escape, perished by the millions in heat that reached hundreds of degrees. What had happened when the very fabric of life is forced to scatter, suffocate, or vanish in days? The Black Summer answered with silence across once vibrant landscapes. The devastation was not uniform. Some ecosystems bore the brunt with catastrophic force. Alpine regions, normally insulated from frequent fire by cool climates, saw flames sweep across mountaintops where vegetation had not burned in living memory. Snow gums in the Australian Alps, adapted to occasional disturbance, were burned so repeatedly in successive years that regeneration faltered, threatening collapse of these unique high-country ecosystems. Temperate rainforests, particularly in Gondwanan relic zones like Tasmania's Tarkine and parts of southeast Queensland, were struck with fire they had not evolved to endure. These ancient rainforests, moist and usually fire-resistant, dried under the pressure of prolonged drought. Flames entered ecosystems that had survived since the age of the dinosaurs, killing centuries-old myrtle beech and sassafras trees in hours. Once burned, these forests do not easily return, leaving gaps where species tied to these environments, such as rare invertebrates and ground-dwelling mammals, lose their only habitat. Eucalyptus forests across New South Wales and Victoria were hit hardest. Eucalypts carry within them an evolutionary relationship with fire. Thick bark for protection, lignotubers storing energy underground, and seed capsules that open in heat. Yet even these adaptations failed against the sheer ferocity of Black Summer. Fires burned with such intensity that soils themselves were scorched sterile, killing seeds before they could germinate. Entire forest canopies were obliterated, leaving blackened stumps across thousands of kilometers. When megafires burned repeatedly through the same areas within weeks, regrowth cycles collapsed. What happened when even fire-adapted species are defeated by fire? That question now hovers over landscapes once thought indestructible. Species survival was split by adaptation. Some, like certain eucalyptus species and fire-following birds, such as the black kite, found brief advantage in the aftermath, exploiting ash-rich soils or preying on exposed creatures. But countless others were pushed to the edge. The kangaroo island dunnart, a small marsupial already critically endangered, saw 95% of its known habitat destroyed in January 2020 when fire consumed nearly half the island. Glossy black cockatoos on Kangaroo Island lost most of the casuarina trees they depend on for food. In alpine streams, the mountain pygmy possum, an animal that survived the Ice Age, faced starvation as fire destroyed the bogong moth populations it relies on. For some species, survival now depends on human intervention. emergency feeding, captive breeding, translocation. Without it, extinction waits. The geographic shifts were immediate and visible. Burned landscapes left animals stranded without food or cover. Survivors crowded into unburned fragments of habitat, intensifying competition and predation. Koalas fleeing fire in Port Macquarie were forced into urban areas, colliding with cars and dogs. In Victoria, wallabies descended into valleys where vegetation was spared, overgrazing fragile remnants. Ecosystems fractured as habitats contracted into isolated pockets, separated by expanses of blackened land where nothing could survive. The collapse of ecological niches rippled outward. Pollinators, like bees and nectar-feeding birds, were lost in such numbers that regeneration slowed, leaving flowers unvisited and seed cycles interrupted. Aquatic systems were poisoned as rains washed ash, soot, and debris into rivers. Fish kills occurred across New South Wales and Victoria, where waterways choked on sediment, depleting oxygen and suffocating entire populations. Frogs and platypuses, already sensitive to water quality, disappeared from streams turned toxic by fire runoff. The destruction was not confined to forests. It reached into every layer of ecosystems, dismantling connections that had held for millennia. Even fire-resistant species suffered under the relentlessness of the season. Eucalypt seeds may sprout after one fire, but when the same ground burned again within weeks, seedlings died before maturity. Alpine ash forests, long thought resilient, saw swathes collapse after repeated burns in 2003, 2007, 2009, and now 2019 to 2020. Regeneration was no longer assured. This was ecological exhaustion, landscapes too frequently scorched to recover. The fire's scale warped migration and distribution. Birds displaced from burned forests moved into cities, altering urban ecologies. Raptors, drawn by exposed prey, multiplied in burned zones, tipping predator-prey balances. Meanwhile, countless species retreated toward the brink, forced into shrinking refuges. What did happen when every refuge is exhausted, every last pocket consumed by flame? Black Summer raised that question with an urgency that science had warned of for decades, but never witnessed so brutally. The numbers tell only part of the devastation. 19 million hectares burned, an area nearly the size of England. 3 billion animals dead or displaced, more than a third of the continent's wildlife population affected. But beyond numbers lay extinction risks, sharpened to a knife's edge. Populations once stable were fragmented into remnants, so small that recovery is uncertain. Habitats that took centuries to form were erased in hours. The very geography of survival was rewritten, not by gradual shifts, but by sudden collapse. The fires of 2019 to 2020 did not just scar landscapes, they exposed their fragility. Alpine regions lost insulation, rainforests lost immunity, eucalypt forests lost resilience. Species adapted to fire were undone by fire too frequent, too intense, too vast. Others, never evolved to withstand it, faced annihilation. The aftermath was not simply blackened earth, but an ecological void where life had been abundant days before. In the silence that followed, the scale of loss revealed itself not in single tragedies, but in the sum of billions. Animals burned, ecosystems fractured, habitats collapsed. The continent itself shifted under the weight of fire, its living systems forced into retreat, its future rewritten hectare by hectare, species by species, until the full truth of Black Summer was etched into the geography of extinction. The flames ended, but the destruction did not. Once the fires of 2019 to 2020 retreated, Australia's landscapes bore wounds that bled into the months that followed. Ash-blanketed rivers and reservoirs, washing downstream in the first rains. Soil, stripped bare of vegetation, loosened and collapsed into gullies, feeding floods with black torrents. Hillsides that had once been thick with forest turned to skeletal slopes, unable to hold back water. What had happened when fire and flood strike the same land within weeks? That question became reality across New South Wales and Victoria as burned catchments delivered silt, toxins, and debris into waterways that sustained towns and ecosystems alike. In January and February 2020, rains arrived across southeastern Australia, bringing short-lived relief from fire but delivering new disasters. The Shoalhaven and Hawkesbury rivers turned the color of charcoal, choking with ash. Massive fish kills followed as oxygen plummeted. In southern New South Wales, dairy farms that had survived fire were then inundated, pastures buried under sludge carried from burned slopes. For rural communities, survival was measured not only in resisting flames, but in enduring the chain reaction that fire had unleashed. The scars across landscapes stretched beyond hydrology. Forests that had stood for centuries were erased so completely that regeneration faltered. In parts of East Gippsland, alpine ash forests burned at such intensity that seed banks in the soil were sterilized. Instead of sprouting with new growth, these slopes remained barren, their regrowth cycles broken. In the Blue Mountains, vast tracts of World Heritage-listed eucalyptus forests, normally resilient, were consumed by megafires so repeatedly that their capacity to regenerate was thrown into doubt. In ecosystems where natural fire intervals once spanned decades, consecutive burns within a few weeks shredded the ancient rhythm. Some areas became long-term scars, landscapes visibly marked by failure to recover. What did happen when forests no longer return, leaving wastelands where complex ecosystems once thrived? This question haunted scientists in the months after Black Summer. The scale of collapse meant that natural recovery could not be assumed, demanding interventions on a scale Australia had rarely attempted. Human recovery followed a similar trajectory, slow, uneven, and marked by scars. Entire towns faced the task of rebuilding with limited resources. Cobargo in New South Wales, devastated on December 31, 2019, rebuilt its main street brick by brick, but the loss of historic buildings could not be reversed. Malakutta, famous for its red sky evacuation, lived for months on temporary housing as reconstruction lagged behind demand. Insurance claims surpassed $2.3 billion nationally, yet many residents struggled with bureaucratic delays, rebuilding permits, and the crushing reality that livelihoods, farms, businesses, tourism were gone. For families who had lost homes, the landscape of survival included caravans parked on burned properties, temporary shelters erected while waiting for reconstruction that took years. Amid this human struggle, new attention returned to the knowledge that had managed fire long before colonization. Indigenous fire management practices, often called cultural burning, resurfaced with urgency. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal communities had shaped landscapes using fire stick farming, small, controlled burns applied with precision to reduce fuel loads, regenerate plant species, and create mosaics of habitat. Colonization in 1788 disrupted these systems, replacing them with European land use practices that suppressed fire until it erupted uncontrollably. After Black Summer, calls grew louder to reinstate cultural burning as a vital strategy. Programs across Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland began to integrate Indigenous knowledge with modern science, acknowledging that the continent had been sustained for millennia by practices attuned to its fire-prone nature. Scientific studies in the aftermath turned landscapes into living laboratories. Teams assessed where forests regenerated and where they failed, cataloged species survival, and mapped shifts in habitat distribution. In the Blue Mountains, researchers studied eucalyptus resprouting patterns, noting that while some species recovered, others showed alarming declines. On Kangaroo Island, wildlife ecologists tracked the survival of species like the glossy black cockatoo and Kangaroo Island dunart, developing captive breeding and habitat restoration programs to prevent extinction. Reforestation efforts began across burned regions. Volunteers planted seedlings in blackened fields, while government programs funded long-term regeneration projects. Yet the challenge was not just replacing trees, but ensuring ecosystems rebuilt with resilience against future fires. What happened if reforested landscapes burned again before they matured? That fear shaped strategies emphasizing mixed species plantings, fire-resistant vegetation, and restoration of wetlands to act as natural fire breaks. Soil scientists warned of another long-term consequence: nutrient cycles disrupted by the intensity of the burns. Fires had burned so hot that organic matter, the foundation of fertility, had been destroyed. Ash layers altered pH levels, delaying regrowth and leaving soils vulnerable to erosion. In alpine regions, thin mountain soils stripped of vegetation slid downslope in landslides, altering terrain itself. The scars of Black Summer were not just visible on the surface. They were etched into the Earth's chemistry. Human recovery was interwoven with this ecological repair. Fire agencies recalibrated their strategies, acknowledging the limits of suppression against megafires. Communities that once resisted hazard reduction now reconsidered. Scientific conferences in 2020 and 2021 focused on resilience planning, combining fire modeling, climate science, and indigenous practice. The Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, established in February 2020, laid bare the gaps in preparedness and coordination, pressing for systemic change. Yet recovery was also a story of resilience in action. Across New South Wales and Victoria, volunteer brigades rebuilt fire sheds, communities raised funds to replace lost equipment, and neighbors supported each other through trauma. International aid and donations poured in, reflecting the global resonance of Australia's ordeal. At the same time, researchers from NASA and international agencies analyzed the fire's smoke plumes, which had reached the stratosphere and circled the globe, leaving a lasting mark on atmospheric science. The aftermath was not only about rebuilding what had been lost, but confronting what had happened if such fires return under worsening climate conditions. Flooded rivers, failed forests, displaced species, scarred communities. These were the layers of recovery. Each step forward was shadowed by the knowledge that the land had changed, that scars might never fully heal, and that adaptation, not restoration, would shape the next chapter. The recovery of Black Summer was therefore not a clean line from destruction to renewal. It was a complex geography of survival where soil, rivers, forests, and people carried the memory of fire. It was rebuilding towns on foundations still warm with ash, replanting trees into soils stripped of nutrients, and relearning fire management from knowledge nearly erased. It was a continent redefining itself after 19 million hectares had burned, rebuilding not only structures, but an entire relationship with the land. The fires of 2019 to 2020 forced Australia to confront questions it had long postponed. For a continent built on cycles of fire, this was not the first catastrophe, but it was the first time the scale shattered the boundaries of history. 19 million hectares consumed, 33 lives lost directly, with hundreds more deaths linked to smoke inhalation. More than 3,000 homes destroyed. Yet beyond numbers, it was the geography itself that seemed to break, ecosystems collapsing, skies turned toxic, and communities living through conditions that scientists had warned for decades would become more common. The lesson was not just about survival, but about the altered future now set in motion. Historical records provided a stark measure of the turning point. Fire has always been part of Australia's environment. In 1851, Victoria endured Black Thursday, when firestorms swept across 5 million hectares, a figure often remembered as the greatest in scale before the 21st century. In 1939, Black Friday left 71 people dead and entire towns in Victoria leveled. The 2009 Black Saturday fires in the same state killed 173, the single deadliest day in Australia's fire history. Yet none of these compared to the geographic reach of Black Summer. What made 2019 to 2020 different was not just the area burned, but the convergence of conditions. Record-breaking drought, extreme heat, and unprecedented fuel loads across multiple states. For the first time, fire crossed landscapes once considered too wet or too cool to burn at such intensity, including ancient Gondwanan rainforests and alpine ecosystems. The role of climate change was not abstract speculation. Data from the Bureau of Meteorology showed that 2019 was Australia's hottest and driest year since records began in 1910. On December 18, 2019, the national average maximum temperature reached 41.9 degrees Celsius, breaking the record set only the day before. These extremes dried vegetation to tinder, creating conditions where lightning strikes or ember attacks ignited infernos that no suppression strategy could contain. What did it happen when a continent's baseline climate shifts so rapidly that the very idea of a normal fire season collapses? Black Summer was the answer written in flame across its terrain. The implications extended into urban planning. Fire had once been considered a rural threat, yet in 2019 to 2020 flames reached the fringes of Canberra, Sydney, and Melbourne. Smoke blanketed the nation's capital for weeks in January, pushing air quality to the worst levels ever recorded. Schools closed, government offices shut, and hospitals struggled with surging respiratory admissions. For city planners, this forced a re-evaluation of how Australia's growing population would live with fire risk. Suburban developments once allowed to expand into bushland fringes now required new codes for fire-resistant construction, defensible space, and evacuation planning. Policy shifted under the pressure of national trauma. The Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, announced on February 20, 2020, examined the failures of coordination, preparation, and response. Its hearings documented how communication broke down between states, how resources were stretched beyond limit, and how firefighting strategies designed for smaller, shorter-lived fires collapsed against events that burned for months. The Commission's report in October 2020 underscored a fundamental lesson. The scale of Black Summer was not an anomaly, but a signal of what climate change meant for the nation's future. It called for expanded aerial firefighting capacity, better integration of scientific forecasting, and stronger national coordination in disaster management. Yet lessons were not only institutional. Ecological conservation faced its own reckoning. Species once thought relatively secure were pushed toward collapse in a single season. The long-footed potoroo, the kangaroo island dunnart, and the glossy black cockatoo faced survival crises. What did happen when one summer resets the conservation status of entire species groups? The fires answered by exposing how fragile biodiversity had become under climate pressure. Conservation programs began to shift from protecting isolated habitats to building resilience across landscapes, recognizing that fire would repeatedly test survival in the decades ahead. The fires also brought renewed urgency to indigenous knowledge. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal communities managed fire through cultural burning, shaping landscapes in ways that reduced catastrophic fire risk. Colonization had disrupted these practices, but Black Summer forced a return to conversations that had too long been sidelined. Programs in Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland began incorporating cultural burning into modern fire management. Scientists documented how these low-intensity burns created patchworks of fuel reduction, fostering biodiversity while preventing megafire conditions. In a continent that had resisted listening to its oldest custodians, the flames made the case clearer than words ever could. Globally, the fires resonated as a warning. Satellite data from NASA tracked smoke plumes rising into the stratosphere, circling the globe, and affecting atmospheric chemistry thousands of kilometers away. The fires became a global event, not just a national crisis. Donations poured in from international celebrities and governments alike, but beyond charity, the world watched to see what had happened when one of the most developed nations faced the limits of firefighting technology. The reality was clear. Once conditions aligned as they did in 2019, suppression alone could not control fire. The lesson was adaptation, reshaping societies, economies, and ecologies to endure what was coming. The legacy of Black Summer carried the weight of trauma. Rural families who lost homes, firefighters who faced firestorms, communities evacuated by sea from towns like Malakuta. These stories etched themselves into national memory. Yet it was also a redefinition of the relationship between Australians and fire. No longer a distant hazard, it became a lived presence shaping daily choices, from insurance premiums to city planning, from conservation strategies to political debate. The fires forced a reckoning with climate denial that had long stalled action. They made clear that adaptation would not wait for political consensus. It was already being written into the land itself. Black Summer's scale placed it alongside the greatest fire disasters in human history. But for Australia, it was not only a season of destruction. It was a turning point in geography, ecology, and policy. The The continent's ancient ecosystems bore scars that would not heal in decades. Its cities rethought how to live with fire at their borders. Its politics absorbed the weight of public demand for change. And its people carried forward the memory of skies turned black and landscapes remade. The continent had been given its harshest lesson, that the future of fire was not an event to be managed, but a condition to be lived within.